There's a bloodline that shaped this country more than almost any other, one that carved out the frontier, filled the White House, wrote the music, and gave the backcountry its whole personality. And most of the people who carry it have no idea it's there. Not because anybody hid it, not because records were destroyed on purpose, but because these families turned into Americans so thoroughly and so quickly that the specific label for who they'd been melted into the bigger identity within a generation or two of stepping off the boat. They went by the Scots-Irish, the Ulster Scots, the backcountry folk, the mountain people, and if your family's been on this continent since before the Revolution, if your line runs through Appalachia, the Shenandoah Valley, or the Carolina backcountry, there's a genuine chance this bloodline runs through you too. Here are 7 signs your family might be carrying it. Stick around to the end, because the 7th sign ties directly into what your DNA results are actually telling you and why they're shaped the way they are. Sign 1, your family has been in America since before 1800, and your roots run through Appalachia. The Scots-Irish migration was one of the biggest, most tightly concentrated waves of people in all of colonial history. Between 1717 and 1775, somewhere around 200,000 to 250,000 Ulster Presbyterians crossed the Atlantic and landed at Philadelphia. From there, they headed south on foot, through Lancaster, down the Cumberland Valley, into Virginia's Shenandoah Valley, across the Carolina backcountry, over the Blue Ridge, and down into the shadowed hollows of East Tennessee and Kentucky. By the first U.S. Census in 1790, the Scots-Irish were already the 3rd largest ancestry group in the young country, trailing only the English and the Germans, and they were packed into one very specific stretch of geography, the Appalachian chain running from western Pennsylvania down through Tennessee into Georgia and Alabama. Over 500,000 people who've taken Ancestry's DNA test carry genetic heritage matching the families who settled eastern Kentucky and northeastern Tennessee. If your family tree runs through East Tennessee, western North Carolina, eastern Kentucky, southwest Virginia, or the Shenandoah Valley, and the family's been rooted there for more than 2 or 3 generations, you're sitting right in the geography the Scots-Irish claimed after walking south out of Philadelphia. That geography by itself is one of the clearest markers that this bloodline runs in your family. Sign 2, your surname has Scottish or Northern Irish roots. Scots-Irish surnames trace mainly to Scotland and Ireland, though English and Welsh threads run through them too. This population brought a distinct set of naming patterns to America, and those patterns are still visible today across the mountain communities they settled. The Mac and Make prefixes, MacDonald, McBride, Bullock, McKinley, McCreary, the classic border Scottish surnames that show up at unusually high rates through Appalachia. Armstrong, Elliott, Nixon, Graham, Bell, Scott, Kerr. The Ulster Scots names that became practically synonymous with the American backcountry, Campbell, Crawford, Henderson, Wallace, Hamilton, line up the most distinctly Scots-Irish American surnames, and you're basically reading a map of Appalachian counties. If your family carries one of these names and traces back to the mountain south before 1800, you're almost certainly looking at a Scots-Irish line. Beyond the Mac and Mac surnames, watch for the specific border Scots names that historian David Hackett Fisher documented in Albion's Seed as the dominant surnames of this migration. Armstrong, Elliott, Bell, Graham, Nixon, Scott, Kerr, Johnston. These aren't just common last names. They're the surnames of specific border families who spent generations along the Anglo-Scottish frontier before the Ulster plantation shipped them to Ireland, and before the American frontier pulled them onward again. These are the surnames of the people who literally built Appalachia. Sign 3. Your family has deep Presbyterian or Baptist roots running through the Appalachian South. The Scots-Irish were Presbyterian through and through, fiercely and unapologetically so. Their faith wasn't just a religious label, it was a cultural and political stance, one that insisted every man stood equal before God, that no bishop or monarch could stand between a soul and its maker, and that any spiritual hierarchy above that was fundamentally illegitimate. As the Presbyterian network stretched thin across the mountain frontier, there simply weren't enough trained ministers to reach every isolated community. Baptist and Methodist preachers stepped into that gap, and they preached with the same raw, personal, direct style that Scots-Irish Presbyterianism had already cultivated. The camp meeting, the altar call, the fire and brimstone sermon, the personal conversion experience that skipped the priest and the bishop entirely, just a soul and its God. The entire evangelical Protestant tradition of the American South, the one still shaping religious and cultural life across Appalachia and the broader mountain south today, traces directly back to the Presbyterian theology the Scots-Irish carried out of Ulster. If your family has deep roots in Baptist or Presbyterian churches through Appalachia, especially if family stories mention camp meetings, revival traditions, or a strong streak of personal moral independence and faith, you're looking at the living cultural inheritance of Scots-Irish religion. Sign 4. Your DNA test shows a Scottish and Irish mix your family history can't quite untangle. This is the DNA sign, and it's the one that trips people up the most. English, or Northwestern European shows, is your top category. Then there's Scottish, there's Irish, and the family story says one or the other, maybe Scottish, maybe Irish, maybe just plain American. But the test seems to be claiming both at once in proportions the family narrative never accounted for. The explanation is what's called the Scot-Irish cluster. A 2017 study, the Irish DNA Atlas, published by Edmund Gilbert and colleagues at the Royal College of Surgeons in Ireland, identified a specific genetic zone spanning both sides of the North Channel between Scotland and northeastern Ireland. The populations on either side of that narrow strip of water, under 20 miles at its narrowest, have been trading genetic material for thousands of years, going back to the Bronze Age, through the medieval Dalriata, kingdom that straddled both coasts, through the Ulster plantation that resettled Scottish families onto Irish land, and through centuries of cross-channel marriages and seasonal movement. The Scots-Irish, who sailed to America between 1717 and 1775, were Scottish families who'd already spent 3 or 4 generations settled in Ulster. Their DNA carries both signals at once, Scottish and Irish, blended in proportions no algorithm can neatly separate, because the people themselves were never neatly separable to begin with. They were the North Channel population, people of both shores at once. So when your ancestry results show Scottish and Irish together in a mix, your family history can't explain with specific ancestors from specific countries, you might not be looking at 2 separate bloodlines that happen to merge somewhere in your family tree. You might be looking at the Scot-Irish cluster itself, the genetic fingerprint of a single population that always straddled that channel, and that ended up crossing the Atlantic to America between 1717 and 1775. Subscribe now. The next 3 signs cover the cultural side, the specific personality traits, the music, and the family traditions researchers have traced directly to Scots-Irish roots. And sign 7 is the one that ties everything back to your own family history in the most personal way possible. Every week on this channel, we dig this deep into the real stories behind the bloodlines that built America. Subscribe, hit the bell, and stay with me. Sign 5. Your family has a tradition of fierce independence, unshakable loyalty to kin, and a wariness toward outside authority. This is the sign people carrying Scots-Irish ancestry recognize instantly the moment they hear it described, not because it's some tired stereotype, but because it's a documented, historically traceable cultural inheritance. David Hackett Fisher, in his landmark book Albion's Seed, traced the entire social and political culture of the American backcountry, straight back to the Border Scots, who eventually became the Scots-Irish. The fierce egalitarian streak, the disdain for inherited privilege, the deep, almost physical loyalty to family and community running alongside an equally deep suspicion of anyone outside that circle, the personal honor code, the readiness to fight anyone who crossed them or threatened their people. Appalachian identity has often been described as rooted in being rather than doing, with relationships that are deeply personal and kin-based rather than impersonal or transactional. None of this was invented on the American frontier. It was carried there from the Scottish borderlands, sharpened through a century in Ulster, and then reasserted itself naturally once the Appalachian Mountains offered conditions similar enough for the old patterns to resurface. Border reaving turned into mountain feuding. Border hospitality, fierce and unconditional, became Appalachian hospitality. Border suspicion of central authority became American frontier libertarianism. If your family has always been the sort that takes care of its own without asking for help, gives everything to the people they trust, and nothing to the people they don't, and bristles at taking orders from anyone who hasn't earned that right, you're describing a cultural inheritance that serious historians have traced, all the way back through Ulster to the Anglo-Scottish borderlands. Sign 6. Your family's musical tradition includes old-time, bluegrass, country, or Appalachian folk music. The sound that came out of Appalachia, the fiddle tunes, the ballads, the modal scales, the call-and-response singing, didn't originate on the American frontier. It traveled there from the Scottish borderlands by way of Ulster, where it had already been developing for centuries before the first Scots-Irish family ever set foot on the Great Wagon Road. The Scots-Irish fiddle tradition, the border ballads, preserving old stories of feuds and love and battle in the same modal scales you still hear in Appalachian old-time music, the pentatonic scale running through both Scottish traditional music and American bluegrass, the drone string on the mountain dulcimer echoing the drone of a Scottish bagpipe, all of it crossed the Atlantic, held in the memory of families who couldn't write music down but could play it and sing it from memory, generation after generation. The banjo, which originated in West Africa and arrived in America through the slave trade, was picked up by Appalachian musicians in the 19th century and fused with the Scots-Irish fiddle tradition to create the distinctive sound that became old-time, then bluegrass, then country. Every country song you've ever heard carries both bloodlines woven into it, the Scots-Irish fiddle in the melody, the West African banjo in the rhythm, and the Appalachian Mountains as the place where the two finally met. If your family has a tradition of making music, fiddle playing, banjo picking, old hymns sung in 4-part harmony, that stretches back through the mountains south, beyond living memory, You're hearing the Scots-Irish musical inheritance in its most direct American form. Sign 7. Your family has a story about coming from Ireland or Scotland, but your DNA shows something that doesn't quite line up. This is the sign that connects most directly to what your ancestry test is showing you right now. Over 3 million Americans report Scots-Irish ancestry, but the true number, people carrying Scots-Irish DNA without knowing it or without ever using that specific label, is considerably higher. The Scots-Irish remain one of America's most compelling ethnic groups, and their stubborn, almost defiant sense of independence pushed them to and past the edge of the frontier over and over again. Here's the pattern worth watching for in your own results. If your test shows Scotland and Ireland in roughly equal measure with no family story to explain why both are present, that's the Scot-IR cluster showing up in your DNA. If your test shows England and Northwestern Europe as the dominant category with Scottish and Irish trailing as secondary categories, that's the typical Scots-Irish American profile after 10 or 12 generations of intermarrying with other colonial populations. If your ancestry DNA groups you with Appalachian or Shenandoah Valley genetic communities, those communities skew heavily toward Scots-Irish descent. Traces of Old Irish and Scottish accents can still be picked out in Appalachian dialects today, 2 centuries after the Scots-Irish first arrived. The speech patterns outlasted the ethnic label. The DNA outlasted both. Maybe your family always said Irish, and the DNA is showing Scottish too. Maybe your family always said Scottish, and the DNA is showing Irish too. Maybe your family always just said American, and the DNA is showing both. Every one of those results, the mix that never quite fits a tidy explanation, points back to the same answer, the same people, the same crossing of the North Channel, the same Ulster counties, and the same walk down the Great Wagon Road. The Scots-Irish simply didn't leave records the way a lot of other immigrant groups did. Plenty of Appalachian and Southern communities never kept thorough records to begin with, and whatever records existed were often lost over the generations. With wooden courthouses standing as the norm well into the early 20th century, no shortage of Southern courthouses burned down over the years, taking whole collections of Scots-Irish records with them. Often, the DNA is the only record left standing. 7 signs, and every single one points back to the same bloodline, the people who walked the Great Wagon Road, who raised the log cabins, who carried fiddles and Bibles and Presbyterian stubbornness through the Cumberland Gap and into the American interior. The Scots-Irish didn't just settle Appalachia, they became it. And the mountains held on to them, kept their music, kept their speech, kept their honor code, and kept their DNA intact for 2 centuries after the rest of the country had moved on. If you found your family somewhere in 3 or more of these 7 signs, the geography, the surname, the faith tradition, the DNA pattern, the cultural inheritance, there's a real chance this bloodline belongs to you too. The question now is what you do with that. Subscribe right now if this video pointed you towards something about your family history you'd never connected before. Every week on this channel, we go this deep into the real stories behind the bloodlines that built America. Subscribe, like this video, hit the notification bell, drop a comment below. Which of these 7 signs matched your own family? Does your DNA test show that Scottish-Irish blend with no clean explanation for it? Tell me your surname and whereabouts along Appalachia or the Great Wagon Road your family traces back to. That's where the real conversations happen on this channel.